Welcome to the Politics Guys Listener Mail Show, where we respond to your questions, comments, and criticisms. I am, of course, Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University, and with me is my regular co-host, Jay Carson. Jay,
yeah.
how you doing? I was like, I blanked for a second. Wait, you're Jay?
We had a long morning. Yeah,
It's been a while. Yeah, exactly.
Marathon.
Absolutely.
Morning,
So I thought we'd just plunge right in. Before we do, I just wanted to point out that if you haven't yet taken the Politics Guys co-host listener survey, where you can weigh in on what you think about all of us, really, but especially our potential new co-hosts, Athena and Alexandra, we'd really appreciate if you do that. And I will put the link to that in the show notes, just like I did for the Saturday show. All right, so it brings us to our first question, which actually relates to this. After Trey's show with Athena King a couple weeks back, listener Mike left the following comment on politicsguys.com. He said, "Where's Jay? Are you seriously railroading him because you don't agree with his stance? The show is trash without him." So
man.
I love that. I love that comment. I love the passion. You know, Jay, you get a lot of flack from people.
I do.
And in fact,
and just to be clear, no, I have not been railroaded. I have not been railroaded. The 3-week hiatus actually just sort of coincided with a couple other things that we're doing. One, trying out some new folks on the podcast, which to some extent is made to be able to let Mike take a break every now and again. And second, I had a trial, and then I was traveling from work, and then I just have all sorts of other stuff that was on my plate. So it sort of worked out as a good time for me to take a couple days off. And I have to tell you, I at the bit, and then I missed a lot of being able to jump in on that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Last couple of weeks when America needed me most, but
No, I agree. It was tough to. I mean, I took 2 weeks off as well, and it was tough to sort of go through that and have all these things happening and not have this forum that you and I have. And I just wanted to also just reiterate that Jay and I are, as far as I'm concerned, the heart and soul of this show. We're the founders, and we have no plans to change that in any way, so that we certainly have other hosts. And in part, it's to give both of us a break from time to time, and I think how we see things going forward.
Because again, podcasting is less lucrative than you might imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
And both of us have to sort of have day jobs and sort of other things, other projects in addition to the day jobs to kind of keep going. So.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm working on trying to get a book project together, and that's going to take a lot of time. But where we'd like to be, I think, is essentially to have, Jay and I, we're going to be doing the show more often than not. But to kind of spell us, we have, on the right, we have Trey, and now we have Will. And right now on the left, aside from me, Ken comes in about once a month or so, and we'd like to get one more person on the left to kind of balance things out, liberal, conservative, different views, and also, of course, to have more diversity, to have a non-guy politics guy. I think that's an important thing. A lot of listeners have asked for that, and I think that would be great if we can do that, which is why we brought Athena and Alexandra on. So that's what's going on with that. And again, if you want to weigh in on that, we hope you do. Please take the survey. It'll be up for probably another week or so, and we really want to hear what you have to say about that. All right. Next, we have Kyle, who writes, "As a Canadian, your recent NAFTA commentary was particularly of interest to me, and I wanted to comment about something Michael said about Canada partly being at fault for not offering concessions on the Canadian Dairy Supply Management Program."
Blame Canada.
Yeah. Oh, it brings me back. Anyway, while at face value, I can see why supply management may be a source of some frustration to the U.S., the notion that something that makes up less than 0.1% of NAFTA in regards to the financials should be a sticking point on the agreement is absurd. While the dairy industry in the States is suffering, Canada's supply management has little to no role in the loss of stability in the American system. It really comes down to automation and genetic engineering. In fact, America has an over $400 million surplus in dairy trade with Canada. Canada just strictly regulates the quality of product that is allowed to enter Canada tariff-free. Next, in order to protect Canadian dairy farmers, Canada needs to maintain regulation simply due to the size of the market in the U.S. versus Canada. Complete free trade would flood the market and crash the industry. I was under the impression, at least from the Canadian standpoint, that the key sticking point in the negotiation was not so much around supply management, but has more to do with Chapter 19 around dispute settlement. Something equally as important to Canadians, especially related to the size differences in GDP and population between Canada and the U.S. A just dispute resolution mechanism is essential for any true free trade agreement to be effective in the interests of all countries. So there are a couple things here. I should point out that
at first I'd say, "Damn, dude knows his dairy policy."
No kidding. They're very, very impressive. And we have a lot of listeners like that who are very, focused and know a lot about policy and have these intelligent and thoughtful comments. I love comments, especially that are very policy and fact focused like that. That's great stuff. Catnip to us. But in the treaty that was signed, the USMCA, which I was pushing to be called Camus, which I thought would sound a lot better. But, as a Marine, anything that starts with USMC sort of also is something I kind of like as well. And it couldn't be Camus because U.S. would be last in that. And, it has to be America first. But
and there would also be the whole sort of, existentialist sort of
thing. Yeah. But a couple of things. So on the dispute resolution thing, Canada basically got what it wanted there. That really hadn't changed a whole lot. Now, on the dairy management thing, that was where Canada lost a little bit. The policy has been relaxed. Now the U.S. is going to be able to ship more dairy products into Canada tariff-free, and that ramps up over time. But that's not something that Canadian dairy farmers wanted, certainly. And so I thought there were two issues here on the dairy supply management program. Well, first is the quality control thing, and my understanding is that essentially that this relates in large part to the growth hormone, genetic engineering thing. And in Europe and Canada as well, to a certain extent, this is a much bigger issue than in the U.S. And basically in the U.S., our argument has been both in Democratic and Republican administrations that this whole GMO thing is not really a quality issue and that there's no reputable scientific evidence that links genetically modified milk or crops with any sort of health or other concerns, and therefore it's not a reasonable basis for a tariff barrier. Is that kind of your understanding, Jay?
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I feel about this as well, and I think a lot of times when people argue about, they talk about how the right can be very unscientific and they argue against climate change and things like that. And I certainly agree with that. But I also agree with the argument saying that, well, the left has this kind of GMO boogeyman sort of thing where they're not really responding to the science, but responding to fears. Right. And I think this is
it is more an aesthetic concern than it is a scientific or safety concern. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, then there's also the thing that Kyle writes about, given the relative sizes of the market, complete trade would flood the market and crash the industry in Canada. And sort of from a free trade perspective, which both of us are free traders, I would say, well, that's a good thing.
Right.
I mean, that's a good thing.
Adam Smith would sort of, that's almost exactly sort of, I think some of the examples he used, back in the day when he was talking about trade between England and France and England and the rest of Europe. If somebody else can do it better and do it cheaper because of their situation, whether it's their natural resources or whatever, their affinity for whatever that certain product or market is, then let them do it. It'll result in more product at lower price for everybody.
Yeah, but that being said, even somewhat conservative economists have admitted that the benefits to free trade, well, not so much the benefits to free trade have been exaggerated, but the harm that comes to certain groups was maybe downplayed because the thought was sort of that, well, there'll be these internal readjustments. People will find other jobs. We'll have retraining programs and other things and, adjustment, various forms of adjustment. And that really hasn't played out as well as a lot of folks hoped. And so my argument, and I think the argument from some people on the left is that, free trade is on balance a good thing, but we need to pay more attention to the workers who are displaced. And that's in part why when these trade agreements are negotiated, that they sometimes go into effect over a decade or more. To phase in, to have this opportunity. And I think we really do need to pay more attention to job retraining and making sure that the groups that are hurt, because this is an example of a policy that has overall very diffuse benefits, but very concentrated costs. And we need to think about the groups that are facing those concentrated costs and what we can best do to ameliorate those costs to those groups. I don't know if you disagree with that.
Diffuse benefits and concentrated costs. I like that. Was that yours, or is that?
It's just kind of I teach a policy analysis course, and that's kind of a big thing we talk about when we talk about analyzing policy. So yeah, kind of on the tip of my tongue, I guess. So, but I do think it's not like you're saying, Jay. Well, to hell with the Canadian dairy farmers. Certainly, you're not saying that, right? Just that. Well, that's an industry that if it's not as competitive and it doesn't offer something that's better in quality, needs to go away. But we also need to, try to find some way to not just throw these dairy farmers, some of whom have been involved in this industry for generations, just out into the street, essentially.
Yeah, well, the other piece of it, and then this is something that, look, say American dairy producers did ship more milk, more cheese, more into Canada. Maybe the response ought to be buy Canadian, right? I mean, amongst Canadians, you can market this as, hey, yeah, you could buy that American crap, or Canadian made, GMO free,
right?
And there's a market for that, and you charge a higher price for it. The market also works that way. The other thing that's kind of weird about this whole thing is my sense was that Trump sort of picked on this whole dairy thing as just sort of here's his talking point, because that was probably the biggest thing he could find in NAFTA of the, where are we really getting ripped off? Well, what's this dairy thing, which was quite honestly not, as Kyle points out, the balance of trade of NAFTA, this is a very, very, small piece. And I think Trump just kind of used that as a talking point and a lever to get more of the renegotiation. And really, it's the issues with Mexico that were the much bigger deal than with Canada.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, we're not concerned about protecting or having the American dairy market take over Canada. I'm sure they might like that, but it's probably even not the top of their priority list. The much bigger piece was manufacturing moving to Mexico.
Yeah, low wage labor,
and then it had to be tied together. So.
I should point out, too, that even though there's been an agreement, Mitch McConnell said that it's not going to be voted on this year. And so, we're assuming this is a totally done deal. And maybe that'll turn out to be the case, but it's going to be the next Congress that votes on it. So, so we'll have to wait and see sort of how that goes. Certainly, my guess would be is that it does get ratified. But, we have elections to come, and this isn't going to happen until 2019.
Yep.
All right. Next we have Jesse, who's one of our Patreon sustaining supporters, been a friend of the show for a while. Wanted to let us know about a problem he's been having with the show of late. So he writes, I've been a little turned off by the dismissive stance you guys generally seem to take to what are, to my mind, some of the most consequential areas of modern politics. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the term Overton window. My complaint with your show is that you keep the Overton window rigorously narrow, when it is often the area just outside society's Overton window that the most consequential and disruptive forces arise from. People willing to talk about things outside the Overton window are often dismissed as lunatics if their claims are nonsensical, or alarmists.
As are we.
Yeah, if their claims are merely unlikely. But the alarmists, people who said things like, Trump could actually win, have been proven horribly right with enough frequency recently that it is irresponsible for you not to give careful consideration to what seem like unlikely possibilities. As it said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. By keeping your Overton window shut too tightly, you're keeping the sunlight out. I like that your show is civil, rational, and so on. But I also think it's closed-minded in a way that rational alarmists like myself find extremely frustrating. So I guess to start with, I should point out to listeners who aren't familiar with the term Overton window. It's sometimes called the window of discourse, and basically it's this idea of what are the sort of range of ideas in normal public discourse that are considered worth talking about, that are tolerable, if you will. And the reason it's called the Overton window is the guy who developed it was a guy named Overton. So there you go.
It was a complete nut.
Yeah. Well, but that's what the idea is. So Jay, what do you think? Is our Overton window too shut too tightly, too narrow?
Here's the thing, and actually there's, complaints on the right that we get sometimes from that too. I mean, a lot dealing with the Russia investigation and the FBI's role and all those sorts of things. And maybe a little bit, but I think, what we try to do here is look at more politics, analyze politics, and talk about policy. And to do that, we sort of have to focus on sort of an agreed set of facts. So often when the facts are in dispute, you and I tend to pick stories where the facts are not in dispute, right? Mm-hmm. And we can have different spin on those facts or what they mean or what's going to happen next. But so often it's difficult to do stories on things if we don't have a definite common factual background that we're talking from. The other thing I think we look at is just one of time limitations, right? I mean, we only have, we can only do two or three or four stories a week, even when we add sort of the extra shows. And we want to, treat them with enough depth, but still have enough variety of material out there. So that makes it tough to get to things that are maybe a little further off the beaten path. So I mean, I guess that's my answer.
And I mean, you're not going to be.
Are you more or less in the same camp as that?
Yeah,
I mean,
I would certainly agree with that. The other thing I guess I would add is that my feeling is that there are a lot of resources for rational alarmists or irrational alarmists on both sides. And, you're right in the sense that I think if we tried to address that, we would simply be too broad and we'd kind of lose our focus. And so in a sense, I think Jesse's right that we have sort of made a conscious decision, at least you and I have, to keep our Overton window somewhat narrow. You're a person of the center right, and now some of the folks on the left would say, no, he's far right. Believe me, Jay is not far right.
Like I said, bring back Joe for a guest spot sometime.
But I certainly am center left, and so we have made a conscious decision to not really focus a lot on those viewpoints, not because we don't believe that they're worthwhile, but in part from what you said, Jay, is because we just can't bring in all that and keep our focus, but also because I think there's a lot out there that already caters to folks like that, And so if you want to hear what further right or further left voices, Pod Save America, great podcast for rational and somewhat irrational, I would say, alarmists on the left, for instance. Ben Shapiro, some other folks, great for people who are a little further right. So that exists. And I would encourage people to definitely check out those other shows. That's just what we decided, not what we're going to be about, essentially. So I don't disagree with you, Jesse. It's just kind of not within what we decided our purview is going to be. At least, especially I think you and I, Jay, and Trey, definitely, and to a certain extent. Now we get into Ken. Ken's certainly a little further left than I am, and so we are bringing in other voices. But I think we're still going to.
Ken raised the argument that the president is in actuality a Russian spy.
Yeah. Ken's Overton window is a little more open.
That's a pretty wide Overton window.
Yeah, exactly. So we do bring these other voices
conspiracy in American history.
Yeah, we do bring these voices in, but I think you and I, and kind of we're the sort of the show's DNA. We're kind of just sort of centrist moderates by nature in a lot of ways, and that affects almost everything.
I want to bring up one other point that sort of so much of what I try to focus on. I think what you try to focus on too is where the ball is really in play, right? I mean, what really happens in the trenches, and from my view, having worked in politics, and your view of looking at it academically, we look at here are the issues that really matter that people decide on, that are take the most, and that tends to be these sort of mainstream sort of things, and you necessarily, I mean, that's like where the action is, where the real blocking and tackling. Yeah. Of American politics takes place. It's and that's just so. I mean, we try to focus on that because I think there are a lot of more fringe things out there. And again, in my experience, most of those fringe things, well, we could have a whole show on this, but look, conspiracies are tough to pull off.
Yeah.
Just really,
You and I
really,
agree about
that's
that.
the
Yeah.
biggest. That's the biggest thing. And there are sort of certain conspiracies, and maybe we could call them conspiracies. It's wrong, or they maybe look like conspiracies, but it's really just sort of people acting their own interest and with their own natural affinities.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Moving on. Let's see. We have Ryan. Ryan writes, I was thinking of the tax policy idea of tying lower wages or lower rates to wages. If you want a lower tax rate, you need to pay your employees a higher wage. If, for example, you pay your employees an average of $15 an hour, you get a tax rate of 30%. But if you pay them $20 per hour, your rate would drop to 25%. These are just some examples of what it might look like. Would something like that work? I know we have incentives in our taxes via rebates, so I don't see how this would be much different. Is this a policy a conservative could get behind? Is this a policy liberals could get behind? Jay, what do you think?
I'd say from a conservative standpoint, probably not. To me, so much of this, it's already built in just in the nature of, look, if you're paying salaries, that is money that you're not taxed on. So it's essentially a tax deduction. The more people you hire and the more you pay them, the less taxes you pay, essentially, as a portion of, you get that bigger deduction. There are, as you said, there can be various kind of rebates for certain types of hiring and so forth, or in certain industries and all that. I think the conservative response would be, no, you don't want to add more wrinkles, more complications, because what that does is just allows people to game the system more. For example, I'm thinking, well, does that mean, so if you have fewer employees but pay them more, do you fall in the lower tax bracket? And does that create sort of a perverse incentive, right?
Yeah.
To have fewer higher paid employees.
Yeah.
Likewise, does it put caps on unemployment to say, well, okay, we'll pay this much or just under this much, but we don't want to give anyone a raise, because if we do, that's going to not or we want to keep everyone in this lower. We want to keep ourselves in the lower tax bracket, so therefore we'll have this wage. I guess those are my thoughts. Again, not having like really thought through the whole thing, but
I sort of like where Ryan's going with this, and I think his thinking on a conservative perspective is, well, if you incentivize companies to give more money to people as opposed to giving more money to government, maybe that's the right kind of incentive a conservative could get behind. Because if your options are to give the government more money or to give your employees more money, well, the more conservative choice would be to give your employees more money, which is why probably it could potentially get some conservative buy-in. My concern with it is,
but again, that's sort of already baked in. Is my response,
right? Yeah. I think my concern with it is very much along the lines of where yours is while it's true that we use the tax system to affect behavior all the time, the more complex we make that, as you point out, the more opportunities there are to find loopholes in the game that system. And I am actually for as simple a tax system as possible, with as few loopholes as possible, as straightforward of rate setting as possible, just with higher rates and fewer loopholes. Maybe you would go for lower rates and fewer loopholes, certainly. But go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, I mean, here's another example of how do you do this counting, and say you've got you've got sort of a holding company or a corporation that owns various subsidiaries. Do you move your lower wage operation stuff out of the country or out into a state or someplace where you don't have to pay those workers as much, and then you keep your higher paid workers in America and then get a tax cut? There's those kind of things that I think would be unforeseen consequences.
CJ,
I've just foreseen some of them, but yeah.
And you are not a tax attorney getting paid, in a lot of money.
Right. I just came up with.
Yeah, exactly. It's on top of your head, so you can imagine. And this to me is why I would love to see something like a VAT. A value-added tax, a pretty simple, straightforward thing. And in fact, there are a lot of conservatives who don't necessarily think that's a bad way to simplify the tax system and get rid of this incredible, disastrously huge tax code that we have that's essentially a full employment act for tax attorneys and accountants and so forth. Now, we could do a whole show on that. It'd be the most boring episode ever, but it'd be fascinating to like 5% of the people who are really into that sort of thing. So, all right. Let's see. We have next Evan, who asks, I've heard lots of criticism about the Libertarian Party and how their socially liberal but fiscally conservative policies look good on paper, but often contradict each other when implemented. I've even heard libertarians compared to communism in the way their ideas seem good on paper but are not practical when actually implemented. This seems extreme to me. What do you have to say to this? Can you give me some examples of libertarian policies that have been implemented successfully? So that's kind of I think at first, to the implemented successfully thing, Jay, I'll defer to you on that. Can you think of any instances in which sort of a libertarian approach has led to overall benefit?
Well, I'd say generally, a libertarian approach, it's a matter of degrees. You can go sort of let's start deregulating various industries. And I think that has yielded a great, deregulating the airline industry. Some people would argue, no, that wasn't great. But look, you can get around the world now much cheaper than you could before. It's greatly changed the availability of being able to fly and where you can get to and so forth. Deregulating the telecom industry. My gosh, where would we be if that wasn't we're still sort of a monopoly with Ma Bell sort of thing.
It's interesting you mentioned that because my mom still sometimes says, I don't know, this would be a long distance call. Like that's
right.
Still, but that used to be the mindset, right? It's like, I can't.
Yeah.
But I wonder if that's more of a technology thing than a deregulate. But that's another story.
Well, it's both. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing: is if you deregulate, if you make sure you don't have state sanctioned monopolies. Or oligopolies, what you've got is competitors who will innovate and move the technology forward. If you don't have that motivation to innovate, I don't think you necessarily get the technology boost that you would.
Right.
So those are places I would say, yeah, the libertarian. And look, if I would argue a lot of what Trump's done with deregulation across the board has generally boosted our business climate. And that's seen in the growth numbers and so forth. So, that's certainly not full on libertarianism, but that's moving in the libertarian direction.
Yeah.
Although the one last thing I would say, in terms of comparing, libertarian regime to the extent that even isn't a contradiction, and communist. Look, I'd much rather live under a libertarian regime than a communist one. And I think really given the choice and with adequate information, most people would make that same choice. So
yeah, I would say that it's thankfully a false choice, and I'm glad that it is because, and here I get to bring in our favorite political philosopher, Edmund Burke. I think all of these sort of radical, extreme philosophies rest on a fundamentally flawed view of human nature. That's the other thing that Evan kind of brings in, that kind of, seem good on paper, but not practical when implemented. I would say absolutely, because they're not based on a view of human nature as sort of flawed and irrational and, that sort of thing. And that's why the thought of someone like an Edmund Burke or David Hume is just so incredibly appealing to me. And I know to you too, Jay, because we recognize how limited we are and why these schemes that suggested people can be these perfectly rational utility maximizers, or that they will, if only freed from the shackles of capitalism, be willing to share and eat to each according to his means, that sort of thing. We know that that's just not how human beings work, and building a society on it. I've kidded with my libertarian friends all the time that, libertarianism would be great if everyone were like you, but everyone's not as rational and intelligent as you, and that's just the world we have to deal with. And so that's the problem I have with radical libertarianism or radical communism, is not that some of their ideas don't make sense when implemented in a broader kind of system that we have, but if you try to put that in place as an overarching ideology, it's bound to fail because of how human beings are and how those ideologies don't recognize some fundamental truths about how human beings are.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
So there you go, because we
Pretty
are
good.
weak and limited individuals, essentially.
If all men were angels, no government would be necessary,
There
right?
you go. Absolutely.
That's John Locke, I think, right?
That's it. Yeah, I think you're right. Actually, well, it's certainly one of the founder kind of era. So I know we fundamentally agree on that, certainly. And on that fundamental agreement, Jay, I think we are all out of listener mail. So hey, if you want us to address your question, your issue, your complaint, you think we got something wrong or we're not talking enough about something, we really want to hear from you. You know how to get in touch with us. It's mail@politicsguys.com, or you can always chime in the comments section of politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. Any of those ways, we want to know what you think about us, what your concerns are, and how we can address them. But until next week, that is it for us. Thanks for listening. We do hope you like what you heard. Also, please remember, if you haven't filled out the listener survey, we would really like you to do that. And again, the link will be in the show notes. That's pretty much it. Essentially, aside from saying the executive producers of the Politics Guys are me, Michael Baranowski, you, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show is produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with the new show next week. We hope you'll join us.